The rationale for this decision was a complex series of reasons having to do with domestic politics in response to air raids and grand visions about the future of the British Empire connected by air routes, and defended, they hoped, by the deterrent effect of strategic bombers. Now, late in 1917, recognizing that this merger was in fact inevitable, several far-sighted officers in the Navy's senior leadership, Admirals John Jellicoe and David Beatty foremost amongst them, took steps to ensure that the Navy's aviators could maintain some form of representation in the post-RNAS world. Otherwise, their voice would be completely lost in the Army-dominated RAF. The solution to this dilemma was the Air Division of the Naval Staff, the successor to the Admiralty Air Department. So the story really begins on December 19th, 1917, when First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff Jellicoe, in one of his final acts as holder of that office, created the staff's Air Division. Now, before going into the work of the Air Division, it's worth spending a moment to explore the structure of the Naval Staff during 1917 to 1918, so as to understand where the Air Division fit in, following the creation of the Air Ministry. This slide is a visualization of the relationship between the RNAS, its administrative air department, and the operational commands represented by the senior naval officers and their respective naval air stations. The important thing here is that this was a self-contained system that Jellicoe essentially created during 1917, with the goal of forming tight relationships between the RNAS wings and groups and the Royal Navy's districts. Now, in January 1918, Jellicoe was replaced by his deputy, Admiral Rosalind Wemyss. At the same time, the Air Ministry was formed. The result of this for the naval aviation practitioners was that they would, upon the creation of the RAF on 1st April, now become responsible to the Air Ministry. The Air Division, as you can see, was meant to act as the Naval Staff's glue, kind of holding the system together, so that the newly commissioned RAF naval aviators would still have representation within the Royal Navy. This slide is a simplification of what the staff actually looked like. The key thing here is that the Air Division was placed under the Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff. It is also worth noting that the Anti-Submarine Division and the Operations Division included officers with RNAS backgrounds, so there was continuous back and forth between the various staff departments with regard to aviation experience. This is the actual structure of the Air Division itself. Now, we know this because historian Nicholas Black recently published the Naval Staff's telephone book for 1918. As you can see, there was a director, a senior and experienced RNAS officer, who was supported by 2 civilian secretaries. The deputy staff officers were located in the Admiralty Old Building, room 45, and handled the real day-to-day work of the division, and were responsible for delegating items to their subordinates in room 42, operations, and room 41, airships and material. We'll hear more about all of these officers soon enough. This is what a typical old building office looked like. The rooms were configured with pneumatic tubes and telephones for quick communication between offices, and as you can see, they're shuffling an awful lot of paperwork. The blueprint here is from before the war, but shows the location of the Air Division's offices. The Intelligence Division, of course, was located nearby. The famous cryptologic room 40 is just to the left of the highlighted room at the top. Now, this is Wemyss's memo actually establishing the duties of the Air Division. The mandate of the division, at its formation, was to deal with all Admiralty business in connection with the Air Service, to maintain the necessary liaison between the Admiralty and the Air Council, and to advise the operations and plans divisions of the Naval Staff on technical points. So what were the Air Division's actual responsibilities? Well, there were in fact several clearly defined areas. The summary of this is that they were dealing with personnel, intelligence, technology, logistics, statistics, and doctrine. As you can see, quite a full menu here. Operationally, this included coastal defense, bombing, airships, aircraft carriers, and anti-submarine warfare. So who was actually working for this division? Well, the first director was F.R. Scarlett, who had his office in room 1616A in the North Block, facing the Admiralty Arch. You can see that just at the top here. He was supported by 2 secretaries, 2 civilian secretaries, one Miss L. Williams and W.A. Medrow, the latter formerly of the Admiralty Secretariat. Now, Wing Captain Scarlett was described by historian Arthur Martyr as an officer of progressive ideas. He was one of the original RNAS wing commanders, having earned his pilot's license from the Central Flying School in May 1913. He had been executive officer of the experimental seaplane carrier Hermes at the 1913 naval maneuvers, and then deputy to the first director of the Air Department, Commodore Murray Suter. Scarlett next became the captain of aircraft, head of the Central Air Office at Sheerness, and in 1915 he proposed and in 1916 oversaw the creation of RNAS Cranwell, the Service Officer School. In February 1916, Scarlett was appointed commanding officer of No. 2 Wing at Mudros, Eastern Mediterranean, responsible for all RNAS ships and squadrons in that region. At the end of August 1917, he was awarded the DSO, having been described by Vice Admiral Thursby as, quote, a brilliant wing captain and an able administrator and good disciplinarian who is likely to do well in the higher commands. On 1st January 1918, Rear Admiral Sidney Fremantle, who succeeded Thursby and was shortly thereafter appointed Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff, specially recommended Scarlett for promotion, noting that he possessed, quote, wide knowledge of both the sea and air services, end quote. Scarlett thus became the first head of the Air Division. The director's assistants were two officers, 27-year-old Wing Commander C.H.K. Edmunds and 42-year-old Commander Lawrence H. Strain, who were both now promoted to Lieutenant Colonels RAF. Charles Humphrey Kingsman Edmonds obtained his pilot's license in April 1912, having attended the Central Flying School, where he was described as very keen and a good pilot. Before the war, he was stationed at Kelshot, and like Scarlett, was aboard HMS Hermes during the 1913 naval maneuvers. He joined the RNAS when it was created by First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill at the beginning of July 1914. Edmonds had been a pilot aboard HMS Engadine when that seaplane carrier was attached to Admiral Beatty's battlecruiser fleet in 1914, and he was aboard HMS Riviera during the famous Cuxhaven anti-Zeppelin raid of 25 December 1914, during which he attempted to bomb some German light cruisers in harbor. He was next transferred to the seaplane carrier HMS Ben Macri and sent to the Dardanelles in mid-1915. It was there, on 12 August, that Edmonds flew several pioneering seaplane torpedo attack missions, successfully disabling Turkish merchant shipping. Edmonds was promoted to squadron commander in June 1916, and during 1917 was in command of No. 6 Wing, the RNAS formation at Otranto, until he was superseded by the arrival of Wing Captain Longmore in January 1918, at which point Edmonds was transferred to the newly created Air Division. Lawrence Strain, the second deputy, had been a lieutenant RNVR and was another RFC Naval Wing pioneer. He had been an observer aboard HMS Ark Royal at the Dardanelles, where he was described as an air observer of great ability and experience who was thoroughly capable of commanding an air station. He was later transferred to Squadron Commander Robert Gordon's force and was stationed in Egypt during April 1916. On 25 July, he was transferred to No. 2 Wing at Mudros, then under the command of none other than Wing Captain F.R. Scarlett, who very strongly recommended Strain for promotion. At the end of September, however, Strain requested to be taken off observer duties, and so was moved to the staff of the Aegean Squadron, where he was then described as an exceptionally able and loyal officer, and was most strongly recommended for promotion. As such, in July 1917, he was promoted to Commander Acting, and then in December to Full Commander, Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. In February 1918, having been recognized as a highly qualified staff officer, he requested a home appointment and was approved, at which point he was attached to the Air Division, and so once again rejoined Scarlett's command. Room 41, the office responsible for airships and kite balloons, was headed by former airship officer Major Reginald F. Maitland, not to be confused with airship pioneer Edward M. Maitland, more of whom we'll hear about later. R.F. Maitland, another RNVR officer, had been on special duty as an airship advisor to the Italian government between June and September 1915, before being transferred to the Air Department where, from November 1915 onwards, he acted as an advisor to the airship establishment at Wormwood Scrubs. He was transferred to the Air Division in March 1918. Maitland was supported by Major William Charles Mitchie, who was an expert on kite balloons. In 1915, Flight Sublieutenant Mitchie had been an observer at the Dardanelles aboard the balloon ship HMS Manica, where he was recommended for promotion and was then employed by Wing Captain Frederick Sykes, later Chief of the Air Staff Sykes, on intelligence and staff work at his headquarters. In December 1915, Mitchie returned to the balloon station at RNAS Roehampton, and at the beginning of 1916, he was promoted to Flight Lieutenant. Early in February, he was transferred to the Air Department, but a medical exam found him unfit for flight duty, a situation that continued until April. Nevertheless, he was promoted to Flight Commander at the end of 1916. In April 1917, he was placed at the disposal of the Anti-Submarine Division for kite balloon duties, with the rank of Acting Squadron Commander. In October, he was transferred back to the Air Department, and in November was specially recognized for promotion. And at the beginning of January 1918, Mitchie was promoted to Full Squadron Commander, at which point he joined the Air Division. Now, the Room 42, responsible for operational concerns, possessed the largest staff, including Major Nicol, Major Wilson, Captain Lander, Captain Wastel, and Captain Hargreaves. And I'll give you the brief overview here. R.A. Nicol had flown B-2C aircraft out of RNAS Whitley Bay, Northumberland during 1915, but his service records otherwise appear to be missing. At any rate, he transferred to the Air Division in January 1918. Leonard Lander was an RNVR officer who joined the RNAS. In August 1916, Lander was injured when his FBA flying boat crashed while flying at RNAS Lake Windermere. In July 1917, he was transferred to the Operations Division of the Staff, where he worked under Wing Commander Hugh Williamson before being transferred to the Air Division in April 1918. 29-year-old Alan Wastel was transferred to the Air Division in March 1918. Wastel was a graduate of the RNAS school at Chingford and had been attached to RNAS Whitley Bay. He was transferred to No. 2 Wing, Eastern Mediterranean, in May 1916, and on 13 December, he wrecked a Henry Farman pusher aircraft as he was returning from a 6-aircraft bombing mission against the Kulali Burgess railway bridge outside Constantinople. Wastel was apparently injured as a result of this adventure and was listed as sick for a significant period of time on his service record. Nevertheless, in May 1917, he was promoted to flight lieutenant, and then in January 1918 to flight commander. He was briefly transferred to the Air Department in February before being moved to the Air Division. 27-year-old Henry Wilson, also originally RNVR, joined the Air Division in March 1918. Wilson was trained at Eastbourne and then Kelshot between October-December 1915, where he was regarded as a good duty officer. Wilson's all-around skill set included tactics, spotting, armaments, engine, and wireless telegraphy. In March 1916, he was aboard the seaplane carrier HMS Vindex, attached to the Harwich Force, which was then where he was described as a zealous and hard-working officer. Wilson was next aboard HMS Nirana in August-September 1917, where he was considered an excellent executive officer with strong leadership characteristics. And in February 1918, he joined the airship torpedo establishment at East Fortune, but was grounded for medical reasons. He was then transferred to the Air Division, where he was responsible for personnel. 41-year-old Percy Hargreaves was another RNVR officer, a lot of Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve people here, of course, who was transferred to the RNAS and attached to the No. 6 Wing Otranto, where he served under none other than C.H.K. Edmunds. Hargreaves was transferred to the Air Division in April 1918. Now, as Nicholas Black has observed, the Air Division possessed considerable air experience, the staff having been drawn from theaters including the North Sea seaplane operations, Mediterranean kite balloon operations, and Adriatic anti-submarine operations. The first task of this experienced group was to oversee the transition of the RNAS, composed of 5,378 officers and almost 50,000 men, not to mention 3,000 aircraft in 55 squadrons, to the control of the Air Ministry. This was a difficult task, and indeed, the relationship between the Air Division, Admiralty, and the Air Ministry was not always clear. In this telegram, for example, the officer commanding No. 18 Group, in fact, Hugh Williamson, was unsure of where Charles Edmonds actually worked. As we can see, the liaison work the Air Division had to do varied significantly, ranging from the trivial to the essential. One vital consideration was the issue of materiel. The Air Division regularly handled papers relating to technology, innovation, and logistics. Examples include improvements to anti-submarine bombs, new torpedoes, hydrophone developments, direction finding, and wireless improvements, turret launching platforms, and even camouflage efforts. A key player in this regard was Hugh Williamson. A request for information from the Air Ministry concerning armor-piercing bombs, for example, was one of the first items discussed by the Air Division. In March, Deputy Strain and Secretary Medro forwarded the information request to Scarlett, who in turn requested that Commander Williamson see him about this subject. Williamson was at this time attached to the Anti-Submarine Division as the head of its small air section, but in May he was promoted to Colonel RAF and Commander No. 18 Group, East Coast of England. Williamson had considerable experience working on anti-submarine weapons, notably with the Blackburn Company, where he had helped develop the Blackburn Kangaroo, which was in fact the most successful anti-submarine aircraft of the war. Williamson's role as an advisor on the subject of ordnance highlights an interesting component of the Air Division story. That is, how it maintained existing personnel networks from the RNAS and Air Department days. For example, Hargreaves, Nicholl, and Edmonds received a report concerning flying boat tactics from the Commodore Lowestoft, but the author was in fact none other than Colonel Charles Rumney Sampson, the famous aviator and armored car pioneer from Dunkirk and Gallipoli, who is now the commanding officer of Great Yarmouth. Sampson proposed that flying boats should be grouped into flights of 6 aircraft to provide defensive fire during reconnaissance missions. Later, Strain and Edmonds forwarded to the Air Ministry a proposal for a self-starting torpedo that had originated from the fertile mind of former Air Department Director Commodore Murray Suter. Airships and kite balloons were vital instruments for anti-submarine warfare, convoy operations, and aerial reconnaissance, and significantly were not systems that the RAF could be expected to have automatic expertise in. One of the first items the Air Division dealt with was a request for information on the performance of dirigibles for coastal defense purposes. Wing Captain Edward Maitland, the director of airships, sent over the request and notified F.R. Maitland, who may in fact have been his younger brother, that an officer should be sent to Dublin to locate a mooring site nearby for Sea Scout dirigibles. Scarlett agreed and once again notified Commander Williamson, who seems to be the jack of all trades here, and then forwarded the request to Arthur Vivian, who was shortly to become the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff. A recurring logistical request that the Air Division had to deal with was the shortage of kite balloon winches, these were hydraulics, that were used in the various anti-submarine mine barrages the Navy maintained, including the Dover Barrage, the Otranto Barrage, and the Northern Barrage, the latter between the Orkneys and Norway, and Chris will talk a bit more about that later. Major Mitchie, as we have seen, was the Air Division's expert on kite balloons, and during June, July, and August, and September, Mitchie was involved coordinating between the Mediterranean commands and the Director of Naval Construction concerning the fitting of kite balloons to various ships on Mediterranean stations. In September, Mitchie received a report from Admiral William Sims, United States Navy, who was coordinating the USN's aviation deployments, including kite balloon work in Ireland. In June, a more mundane issue came across the Air Division's desks. Mitchie and Maitland were asked to comment on a proposal from Jackie Fisher's Board of Invention and Research concerning the development of new binoculars. The two airship specialists were critical of this proposal, as the binoculars they saw were in fact too heavy for kite balloon or airship operations. Unlike the binoculars, a subject of considerable importance that routinely crossed the Air Division's desks was the circulation of reports relating to bombing operations. Early in June, Edmonds received a proposal from the Admiralty regarding the possibility of bombing Constantinople. Later that month, Scarlett forwarded the telegram to Major General Frederick Sykes, who was then Chief of the Air Staff, having replaced Hugh Trenchard. The operation was in fact carried out several months later on 2 nights in September, but with the loss of several aircraft. Meanwhile, the Admiralty was requesting that the Air Division contact the Air Ministry regarding reinforcements for the naval squadrons in the Felixstowe, Yarmouth, and Dunkirk Triangle, as more fighters were needed to intercept Germany's counter-bombing program, which was then targeting Dunkirk and interfering with coastal operations and mine locating off Felixstowe, a result of Ludendorff's spring offensive, which had placed Dunkirk back on the front lines. Early in September, Edmunds and Nicol received a request for information from Chief of the Air Staff Sykes regarding a proposal for the bombing of Hamburg with large America flying boats launched from destroyer-towed lighters. Edmonds had never heard of this program, but the RNAS had been a pioneer of long-range bombing. This is something that the RAF would like you to forget. And the longest continuous bombing operation of the war was in fact carried out by RNAS Dover Dunkirk under Wing Captain, now Brigadier General, Charles Lamb, against the U-boat bases and industries on the Belgian coast. Bombing targets in urban areas was of course always controversial, and indeed sometimes illegal. The bombers occasionally missed their targets. On September 2nd, for example, Secretary Medro flagged a report from the Censor's Office describing the accidental bombing of Sluis by RAF aircraft on the night of 15-16 August, in which 2 bombs were dropped and which the Dutch ambassador had been instructed to raise with the British government. Kind of shades of Churchill being criticized for using aircraft to bomb Friedrichshafen in the beginning of the war in 1914, was criticized by the Swiss government. In August 1918, Brigadier General Robert M. Groves succeeded Scarlett as director of the Air Division. Groves, described by the official historian as an officer of ideas, had originally joined the Navy at a young age and specialized in wireless telegraphy. He then joined the nascent Naval Wing, where he commanded some of the Navy's original airships. He quickly advanced, and 2 months into the war was promoted to wing commander and then to assistant director of the Air Department. During 1916, Groves commanded RNAS No. 1 Wing Dunkirk, where he personally flew reconnaissance missions over Ostend and worked on night flying techniques. He was then transferred to Lord Curzon's 1st Air Board, where he was assistant to Committee for Imperial Defense Secretary Maurice Hankey. Groves retained this post when the chairmanship descended upon Lord Cowdrey in 1917. Now, following the creation of the Air Ministry, Groves was briefly Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, having been appointed a director during the short tenure of Air Minister Rothermere. This is the famous Rothermere-Trenchard controversy, no doubt you're aware. During this time, Groves personally flew a number of experimental aircraft and met with various naval officers to discuss the development of naval aviation under the new regime. Groves was therefore a natural choice to succeed Scarlett, as he was already in fact acting as a liaison between the Air Ministry and the Navy. Now, while he was Assistant Secretary to the Air Board in 1917, Groves had worked with Rear Admiral Richard F. Phillimore, who was then responsible for flying experiments at Rosyth, including the development of aircraft launching platforms for capital ships. Groves thus had a particularly close relationship with Phillimore, which was significant because at the beginning of 1918, at David Beatty's recommendation, Phillimore became the admiral commanding aircraft and was responsible for all Grand Fleet aviation. Phillimore commanded the Grand Fleet Flying Squadron, which was built around the carrier HMS Furious. By October 1918, this force included HMS Argus with its Sopwith T-1 torpedo bomber capability. An example of what the Flying Squadron was doing arrived at the Air Division on 9 September when Nicol and Lander received Phillimore's recommendation that one Lieutenant Dawson be promoted, considering his exceptional skill as one of the pilots in the stunning Tondern raid of 19 July. This was the most successful naval airstrike of the entire war, in which Zeppelins L-54 and L-60 were destroyed in their sheds by 6 Sopwith Camels launched from Furious. You can see the telegram here, which is preserved in the Air Division files by Nicol and Lander. Now, on 21 October, Nicholl received a copy of an Admiralty reply to the Air Ministry approving the deployment of 6 aircraft from number 201 Training Squadron, which was in fact the Torpedo Development Squadron equipped entirely with Sopwith T-1s. The East Fortune crews and aircraft were deployed aboard HMS Argus beginning on 15 October, and, had the war continued, would have been used to attack Wilhelmshaven in 1919. You see a propaganda group collection of photographs here showing the expected decisive attack against the High Seas Fleet. Although the naval war was ending, the struggle against the U-boats continued until the last minute. The imperative to develop and cultivate effective anti-submarine tactics was something the Air Division took especially seriously. As early as 8 March, Medro and Strain had prepared a request for intelligence on U-boat performance, types, and tactics to be circulated to the RNAS stations and units engaged in anti-submarine warfare. This was the beginning of the process that would lead ultimately to the creation of the Air Division's various anti-submarine manuals, the first of which was a pamphlet on U-boat identification that appeared in April. By October 1918, of course, coastal aircraft and airships were ubiquitous, coastal convoys had been implemented in all of the threatened waters, and indeed the submarine chasers were deployed, as Chris will tell you about, and the Belgian U-boat bases were soon to be overrun in the general Allied advance, putting an end to the submarine threat. Which brings us to the end of this story. The Air Division, perceived by the post-war Air Ministry as a fifth column, was closed down in the summer of 1919 during the Air Ministry's Carthaginian disbanding of the former RNAS squadrons. The division was supposedly replaced by the RAF Coastal Area Command under Air Commodore Arthur Vivian, but even this establishment was downgraded to a regional command in 1920. Admiral Beatty, after 1st November 1919, acting as First Sea Lord, was able to temporarily fill the vacuum by creating the Air Section of the Naval Staff, with Commander Richard Bell Davis, one of the few senior naval aviators who did not join the RAF, as its head. Some of the former Air Division members indeed continued their careers with the RAF, while others were demobilized and retired. William Mitchie was transferred to the unemployed list in March, Edward Lander was moved there in April, and Percy Hargreaves was transferred to the unemployed list in July. Alan Wastel, on the other hand, was sent to the 2nd Brigade, and then in September to the Southwest Area Command. He was attached to the HQ North area in March 1920, but was taken ill as a result of his long-suffering injuries and was medically retired in July. Reginald Maitland, for less than a month between September-October 1919, was listed as serving with Vivian in his newly established Coastal Area Command, but was then immediately transferred to the unemployed list on 6th October. It is unknown what became of Wilson and Nicholl, although the odds, of course, favor demobilization and retirement. Charles Edmunds became a director of the RAF Staff College, Andover, where he was responsible for educating future RAF officers, Charles Portal not least amongst them. Lawrence Strain produced a history of the RNS war effort, and copies were made for the Air Ministry, the Lloyd George Cabinet, and indeed the United States Navy. Strain was then also transferred to the unemployed list in February 1919. Brigadier General Groves went back to the Air Staff and other RAF commands. He was appointed acting chief of the Air Force Middle East, but was killed in a flying accident in Egypt in May 1920. Brigadier General Scarlett became the commanding officer number 12 Group in May 1919, then the commanding officer RAF Halton in December, and in 1920 was transferred to the RAF with a permanent commission. In September 1924, he was head of the Coastal Area Command, and he became the CNC Air Defense of Great Britain in 1928, and then the CNC Middle East between 1929 and 1931. He retired as an Air Vice Marshal in 1931. And I'm going to conclude now. Researchers have generally ignored the archives of the Air Division, as the papers seemingly neither fit into the historiography of the young RAF or into the post-First World War history of the Fleet Air Arm. Nevertheless, the Air Division was staffed by highly qualified, pioneering officers who had brought with them a wealth of knowledge and important network connections. The Air Division's files demonstrate that the staff officers involved were committed to learning from the experience of the war and were responsible for producing and circulating vital operational research and doctrinal manuals. In fact, they represent a prototype operational research organization. With hindsight, the Air Division was in fact a model of joint staff work, and clearly the future of inter-service cooperation. The tragedy is that the lessons and best practices the Air Division provided to the Navy and RAF were not cultivated and expanded upon after the war. The Air Division instead was unceremoniously dismantled in the petty inter-service rivalry over roles and budgets that resulted from demobilization. The Air Division model had to be completely relearned during the Second World War and at no small cost. So thank you very much.